Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick O'Halloran. Thank you for attending. This is IDERA's broadcast on our tool, SQL Diagnostic Manager for MySQL and MariaDB for monitoring MySQL databases. This is primarily a technical walkthrough of the product. I've got a few things I want to talk to you about what the product is, how it's architected, things like that. And then I'll walk through some features and functions around the 5 points that were in the invitation you got about how to identify problems using DM for MySQL, how to gain visibility into the overall health of your MySQL servers, how to generate alerts based on bad activity, how to take action before MySQL runs out of resources, and then how to get high return on investment and increase DBA productivity. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I think it's a federal law that I have to do this. All presentations require PowerPoint nowadays. But I'm going to skip most of this. This is a presentation I put together a little while ago. This will be sent to you after this broadcast, and if you do take a look at it, let me just get through here. You'll see that I've got pretty extensive speaker's notes. So if you do look at this later, feel free to browse through it and read through all these notes. There's quite a bit of information there. All right, so the name of the product we're going to look at today is SQL Diagnostic Manager for MySQL and MariaDB. It's a very, very long name. It used to be called Monyog. There was a company called WebYog that owned a couple products, SQL Yog and Monyog. IDERA acquired WebYog about a year and a half ago, and Monyog was rebranded as DM for MySQL. It's got about a 20-year development history behind it. It does a lot of reporting on activity. It's a great tool for people who are maybe new to MySQL. Maybe they're SQL DBAs, SQL Server DBAs, or Oracle DBAs, and now they've got to monitor MySQL. There's not a lot of products out there that help you with that. So today we're going to walk through this one. What does it do? Monitors and reports on activity. So you give it a list of MySQL instances. It's going to go out. It's going to pull them for what sessions are active, what wait events are being generated, and so on. It is agentless. There's nothing we install or modify on the monitored systems. It's very, very, very low overhead because it's agentless. It's on-premise, meaning that it is an encapsulated application. It's a web-based application that's all running on your hardware or a cloud machine that you've designated. It is super, super easy to set up and run. I started programming 30 plus years ago. I've been in software for 20 of my 30 years of my professional life. And this is probably one of the easiest packages I've seen on how to install, how to get it up and running. And as a software developer, I hate to say this, but this just works. A lot of software has little glitches here and there. One of the things I'm most impressed about with DM for MySQL is it installs quickly and it works. And then it monitors on cloud, on-premise and cloud databases. There's a lot of different versions of MySQL. MySQL was originally developed by a man in Sweden as open source software. Oracle's taken over. There's a couple main branches there, plus the various cloud providers have their own versions of MySQL. All those versions on cloud, on-premise are well supported by DM for MySQL. Here's a slide that just kind of describes the architecture of what it looks like. DM for MySQL is installed on a host. This could be a Windows machine. This could be a Linux machine. Everything that's needed is installed here. So there is an HTML server that users through Chrome or IE or Firefox or their favorite browser connect through a browser to the DM for MySQL server. They bring up pages to look at graphs, look at charts, look at dashboards, configure alerts, all that. At the same time, this DM for MySQL host is querying the databases that are being monitored. It's 24/7, it's up all the time. Every 5 seconds, or depending on what metric it's looking at, it's querying, pulling back data about performance and storing that in a SQLite database. So SQLite is something I hadn't heard of before I started working with DM for MySQL. It's just another third-party relational database. It's entirely self-contained within the DM for MySQL installation. So when you install DM for MySQL, either through Windows as a wizard or Linux as a package, the server, HTML server, and SQLite database are all installed with it. couple of quick questions I get asked all the time. How big does the SQLite database get? Well, it depends on how many instances you're monitoring. Just for sizing purposes, we tell people 3 to 5 gigabytes per monitored instance. So if you're monitoring 20 instances, that could be 60 to 100 gigabytes of data for sizing purposes. Depends how busy they are, how much activity is going on, and so on. Another question is, how do I access the SQLite database directly, or can I access that SQLite database directly? It's open, the schema is advertised, and there are plenty of third-party products for command line access to SQLite database using typical SQL statements. There's even browser built-in, so I've accessed the tables in the SQLite database through a browser as well. So it's quite open. You can pull the data out directly if for some reason you can't configure the application to do what you want it to do. How do I get it? Well, if you go to idera.com, you can go to the products page. You can go to the SQL Diagnostic Manager for MySQL dropdown. And when you select that, you've got an option to download it for a free, fully functional 2-week trial. The only limitation on the trial is that you can only monitor 10 instances. But other than that, all the features are there, all the functions are there. We do have customers that are monitoring tens, hundreds. I think the largest one I know of, someone's monitoring 1,200 instances of MySQL from one DM for MySQL installation. But as I said, you can download the free trial, 2-week trial. It installs as a wizard. This literally takes 30 to 60 seconds. It's very straightforward. You can just accept all the defaults and go through. If you want to install DM for MySQL on a Linux system, it installs as a package, pretty standard. There's instructions here on the command lines you need to run, permissions you need, directories and things for getting it installed in Linux. Accessing it, now that you've got it downloaded and up and running, and as I said, you can have this up and running in a couple minutes. It's a browser-based thing, so I can just type in a host name and give it the default port 5555, which is configurable. And with that, you jump into the login screen and so on. Now, there's a lot of other pages here in this PowerPoint presentation. There's about 50 or some odd slides that walk through the product. But what I'm going to do instead is just give you a live demo and walk you through the features and functions pertaining to the 5 points that were listed in the invitation. So here I am. I'm on Idera's website, and I just want to show you one more time under Products, under Diagnostic Manager for MySQL. There's a free trial right there. So I click it, I download it, and I'm up and running in just a matter of minutes. Once I've got it installed, it's just a matter of typing in the URL of where it's installed. And again, the HTML server and everything else is built in as part of the install. I'm going to click down here just so I can see what these tabs are. It's a little easier during demos if you can read these words as we go along. Let me log out, actually. So you see it when you first come in. There's a login screen. All the logins, admins, or whatever individual users you create are created and maintained within DM for MySQL. You can set up different users that have access to different servers and different tabs. There's a little bit of security and a little bit of granularity you have there and who has access to see what. Before I dive down into the technologies, I want to show you the most important thing I can show you today. So if you remember 2 things, remember that you can get the download at idera.com, and then remember documentation. It's just fantastic for a self-guided tour. If I click on this, it opens up the wiki that's on the idera.com website, and I've got various categories here. I'll point out this one, Navigate SQL DM for MySQL. If I expand that, I've got overview, servers, dashboards, monitors, threads, real-time. If I go back to my browser here, that's exactly what this is. I've got overview, servers, dashboards, monitors, threads. So as I'm looking at this product and evaluating it, and say I'm looking at monitors and I forget how do I configure these, how do I change what it is I'm looking at, I can go to the documentation, go to Navigate SQL DM for MySQL, go to monitors, and now I've just got a ton of information about what I'm seeing on the screen. That's very, very good for a self-guided tour. All right, so that's some of the standard steps I needed to cover: getting a free download, how to access it through a web browser, and certainly looking at the documentation. The first thing you're going to do when you get this is set up servers. There are 8 different servers set up here that we're monitoring. They're in horrible, horrible condition. A lot of these have critical events going on. A lot of them have warnings going on. If this were a well-maintained system, these would all be green. If this were my systems that I was responsible for, I would be a little intimidated by seeing all this. But this is a sandbox. We issue demonstrations. But I click on here and look at this. These are all privilege warnings, security warnings, things like that. It's not actually affecting the performance of the system. It's just some warnings about the configuration of the system. But anyway, what I'm going to need to do when I first come in, since this will all be blank and I won't have any servers, I just need to add a new server. Like, it's pretty straightforward. Give it a host name, give it a port number, log in credentials to MySQL, and then various connection types. Usually direct, but if you're using SSL encryption or tunneling, that's accessible. When I create my server, I can give it tags. Tags are just free-form names. I can apply multiple names to this server. So maybe it's production, maybe it's the name of a data center, maybe it's the name of an application. It's just a way of organizing servers. And as I go through these other various tabs, I can use tags to pull up groups of servers. So maybe there's a cluster, maybe there's an group of servers around an application. That customer that has 1,200 instances they're monitoring, they use a very liberal use of the tags, so they can quickly bring up subsets, groups of 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 of those servers at a time that they need to monitor. Some various things under advanced system metrics. If I want to capture OS metrics, say CPU use, page faults, I/O, things like that, I need to establish extra credentials to connect to that. Similarly, if I want to read error logs and query logs, MySQL has a slow query log and error log. Those can be maintained as tables in MySQL, but typically they're configured to be files on disk. If they're in the database, they could be queried directly, but if they are on disk, I need some extra credentials here so I can go through the operating system or go through the cloud API to get to those files to read the error logs and stuff. So there may be a couple extra things you need here. But pretty much all I need to do is specify my connection credentials, and if I want some tags, and if I want operating system metrics, some information there. So once I've got this, I've got a high-level view now of how do my servers look. From this overview, I can look and see that here's the servers I'm looking at, and this is where I can select tags and select groups of servers. That's where tags come in handy. Or I can specify individual servers. And right away, I've got some very good information. I've got information on how many servers I'm looking at, how many are down, how many have critical alerts. Ideally, this would be 0. And how many are warnings. So like most alerts, we call them monitors. Monitors have a low threshold that goes yellow, and then a high threshold goes red. And I'll talk about those in a little more depth in a minute. But what's very, very handy here is I've got the top SQL, the SQL that's taking the most time over the last week. If I am interested in a particular server, I can very, very quickly just come here to overview and see, here's the SQL statements that are taking all the time. This is executed 1 million times, took a total of 23 minutes to execute this 1 million. It's taking sub-milliseconds, and that one's not bad. All these average times are pretty good. There's not much I can do here as far as performance tuning goes. But if this changes, if one of these starts creeping up into seconds or minutes, that gives me a nice target to focus on just by clicking on here to see what statements are taking the most resources. Servers, as I said, can show me the status of all the individual servers. As I clicked on this one, the Galera 3 server, and most of what's here is privileges information. MySQL privileges are slightly different than Oracle or SQL Server. So if you're not quite sure what level of security you should be having, the out-of-the-box monitors are pretty good in identifying potential security holes, excess privileges that are granted, options, things that are exposed and open, accounts without passwords, root user without password. Those are all kinds of bad things, potentially bad things. This will address it to you. I can click on here now and go and look at what this is, what advice on how I can fix this potential issue. If it's not really an issue, I can just close it and it will be ignored. I will pretty much just walk from the top down to the bottom, and I'll talk about the various points in the email, the invitation, as we get through them. Dashboards are common among a lot of monitoring tools, and this one's no different. Dashboards consist of pages. Pages consist of charts, so I can switch what pages I'm looking at. The charts change. I can add and delete pages. I can edit a page and add and delete the charts that are on there. So there's a lot of out-of-the-box charts that are available. I can also create custom charts. If I, for example, look at this chart, I've got titles, and then I've got this strange thing down here, which is an array of values. This is actually JavaScript code, and this is just showing an array of different objects within what's called the Monyog object model. All the statistics that DM from MySQL captures as it queries about connections and throughput and executions and wait events and locks and deadlocks and cache hits and all that. All those counters are available. They're in the documentation. If I go back to the documentation and look at monitors, I've got the Monyog object model here. So I've got all the objects available as well as how they're populated, where the data comes from. All that's available in DM from MySQL itself. I can do calculations here. I can show percentages, whatever it is I need to percent. So I can create my own charts if something isn't out of the box. But as far as the dashboards go, as I said, dashboards consist of pages. Pages consist of charts. And here's where I can select what servers I want. Here's where I can use tags to change what servers I'm looking at. I can change the time frame I'm looking at. I can zoom in on these various charts. So this gives me a nice historical look. As I said, the SQLite database holds by default a week's worth of data. And all that data is available through the application as well as directly through the SQLite database. So whether it's number of queries executed, availability, connections, as I said, there are dozens and dozens of charts available that I can look at based on cache hit ratios, rows modified, bad logins, if I'm doing replication or clustering, a lot of information about that as well, CPU use. So this is just showing data over time, and as I said, the time is configurable. Monitors are where all that information is coming from. There's some 600 out-of-the-box monitors. These are called monitor groups. Every one of these consists of a group of individual monitors. So if I look, say, at this one, the first thing is for the server I have selected right now, these are all green, but I can select groups of servers. Let's do this. Let's see what we get. So now I can see for some of the servers I have selected in this group, one or more of the monitors has gone yellow, meaning it's exceeded a low threshold. And here I can quickly see, here it is. For security, I can quickly see for the monitors I have selected, which individual monitors have exceeded a high threshold. So this group of monitors consists of, this monitor group consists of individual monitors. And these are like alerts. They're metrics that are constantly being sampled, and then they're compared against a low threshold and a high threshold. If the low threshold is exceeded, an action takes place. If the high threshold is exceeded, an action takes place. And an action is typically an email or communication to end users through some way, through Slack, through PagerDuty, through SNMP traps. But there's a lot of information I've got here. Again, I can specify timeframes. I can look at these values over time. If I if I mouse over it, I've got a description telling me what this individual monitor is doing. And then for most of the monitors, I've got advice, which is kind of handy if you're new to MySQL and you're not quite sure what a monitor is telling you or what you should be doing. There's a lot of built-in knowledge here on if something abnormal is happening or something abnormal is about to happen. Here's some steps you can take. Here's the description we saw earlier. This is interesting. This is for this specific monitor. This is more JavaScript, just like we saw on the dashboard screen for an individual chart. This is JavaScript that returns a value. In this case, this function is returning a cache hit ratio. Now, a cache hit is when a query needs a block of a table or a block of an index, and first it goes to see if that block is already in memory. And if it is, that's a cache hit. If that block is not in memory, it needs to go to disk, that's a miss. And then because you've got to go to disk, you've got to take time to do that. Disk is much slower than memory. High cache hit ratio means that your queries are making effective use of the cache. They're hitting data that's already in memory instead of in disk. So this is just giving me a ratio, a percentage of number of successful reads to the total number of read requests. And as we saw when I looked at that graph, it's nearly 100% for this database instance. When this falls below a threshold, that's bad. But the idea is that this JavaScript function can do anything you can do in JavaScript, any calculations using any of the values in the Monyog object model, using anything you can call from JavaScript. Typically, the out-of-the-box monitors you're not going to need to modify, but if you do for some reason, you can. You can restore them later to their out-of-the-box state. But if you do need to modify this for some reason, that's certainly possible. We'll see also when we do custom monitors, that's a very, very powerful feature. You can write your own functions that return back a value for a monitor. So this is half of what the each monitor does. It returns back a value. The other half of what it does is it defines a low threshold and a high threshold. And if that low threshold is exceeded, it goes yellow. If the high threshold is exceeded, it goes red. And that's this alert condition function. And again, it's just JavaScript code that can do anything you can do in JavaScript. This function specifically returns back the word none, the word warning, or the word critical. And if it returns none, DM from MySQL says, okay, the status of this monitor is green. If it returns back a warning, it's like, okay, the status of this is yellow. I need to take whatever actions are associated with this monitor when that goes yellow. And similarly, if it returns the word critical, DM from MySQL will say, okay, this monitor has gone critical, it's gone red. This particular alert is calculating or is taking the value from, there it is, it's returning the value of this get warn status function. What this does is it takes the value that we saw earlier from this JavaScript function, and if it exceeds this value, because the word false here, when it goes below this value, it returns the word warning. When it goes below this value, it returns the word critical. And here's where this dot warning is. Here's where this dot critical is. And these are also JavaScript. So if I need to put conditions in here based on server names or tag names or time of day, all that's available too. I could make this an if structure and change the critical threshold based on tags, based on servers, based on time of day, based on whatever I can put inside a JavaScript function. But the architecture, the infrastructure of DM from MySQL is just running this function, and if it returns yellow, it could potentially send notifications. So I've got ways here of sending emails. If it goes yellow, if it goes red, maybe to different groups. Do I want an email every time it's measured, or just the first time the status changes? Do I want to be reminded every once in a while? I've got several conditions here where I can change how often I'm notified. One of the problems I've seen with alerting systems is that they're too sensitive in some cases. There's too many alerts that are turned on. There's too many notifications that are being sent. So many notifications so that people who are receiving the notifications eventually just create an email rule and shove all the unread emails into a folder they never look at. Having alerts you ignore is probably worse than having no alerts because people think you're monitoring something when you're not. There's enough configuration here, both in the alert function, the thresholds, the overrides, that I can set this to really notify me when something important is happening, something that really needs my attention. And that way I'll know that when I get that notification from DM from MySQL, that it's something I really need to pay attention to. And as I said, there's some 600 out-of-the-box different conditions, some of which pertain to the operating system, some of which pertain to replication or clustering. But they're to security, to internal counters. There's a lot of knowledge built into this on what it's looking for, as well as the descriptions and the advice that comes with each of these. Something that I think is very, very, very powerful is I can create my own custom counters. Now, that's sort of a two-step process. One of the things I do is I create what's called a custom SQL object. Custom SQL object is just a select statement I write. It can do anything you can write a select statement to do. An example I use all the time is, suppose in your application you're using a database table as a job queue. And every time you want to process a job, you insert a row into the table. And every time you're done processing a job, you delete the row from the table. So the number of rows in the table represent the number of jobs that have been submitted but haven't been processed. I could very, very simply create a new custom SQL object on CSO that just does a select count on the table. I need to identify with a name. I need to say what servers I want to run this custom object on, how often I want to run it, how long I want to keep the data for. And the infrastructure of DM from MySQL will now obediently run this SQL statement on whatever servers I specify with whatever frequency I specify, and it will store that result in the SQLite database. So I've now created a way of gathering my own information. More importantly, I can write CSOs that are not related just to MySQL, but are related to an application. So I can monitor not just the database, but I can monitor the application. Maybe I've got help desk tickets and I want to get a count of tickets that have been open for more than a day or 3 days. Maybe I've got purchase orders and I want to be notified when a purchase order for a particular customer comes in because that one needs extra special handling. If I can write a select statement that pulls data out of the database, I can write a custom object that retrieves that data from the database and stores it in my DM from MySQL's SQLite database. And again, the importance of that is I can monitor not just a database, but an application. Second thing I can do is I can create new monitors as well. When I create new monitors, I've got the same things. I've got names, I've got value. And again, this is the JavaScript function. In the documentation, there's templates I can just paste in here. But I can specify my own JavaScript function that returns back. In the case of my example where I was just doing a select count, maybe the value I'm returning is just the most recent count on the table. And I can create alerts. Again, there's templates you can copy from the documentation on alert conditions. But I can set thresholds of maybe 10 and 15. And so now in a matter of a few minutes, I've created a custom monitor that looks at the size of one of my application tables. And if it gets above 10 rows, I get an email notification. If it gets above 15 rows, I can get an email notification, or maybe a larger group of people get an email notification. That's incredibly powerful. The infrastructure of how do I run the statement, how do I capture the data, how do I store it, how do I check it against thresholds, how do I notify people, all that's already built into DM from MySQL. I just need to create the count, the select that retrieves the data, and the JavaScript functions that return a value and then return back the word none or warning or critical. And again, there's templates for those. That's quite handy. All right, so if I'm looking at dashboards and monitors, I kind of consider those as general monitoring things. They're going to tell me that something's wrong. Either something looks bad on a dashboard, or maybe I've got an email notification. The rest of these tabs down here, threads through application, are places I can go to get more information. Threads within MySQL context are connections, and threads and processes are all pretty much synonymous. These are server-side processes that are running, that are processing SQL statements. So maybe I've got a problem with a deadlock. Maybe I've got that the dashboard showed me about, or a monitor showed me about. Maybe I've got high CPU use. Maybe I've got long-running threads. I can go here and select, again, using tags or just selecting individual monitors, groups of monitors. And for each monitor, I can see who's connected. Are they idle? Are they running something? If they're running something, what are they running? How much CPU time or processing time are they generating? And this is automatically updating every second. Now, if I've got the access to do it, I can kill threads here. I have to have permissions to do that, both within MySQL and within the configuration of my user I logged in with. That's kind of useful if I've got, say, a locking situation. Maybe I've got someone who's running a very, very long transaction and other users are waiting for that lock and they're not timing out. I've got the ability, maybe the monitors is telling me that, hey, there's a lot of lock time going on. I can go in here and see who's running SQL statements. Maybe they're running bad SQL. Maybe they're running ad hoc queries that are churning through data cache. But this is sort of a photograph of here's what's happening right now. RealTime is more if I think of threads as a photograph of what's happening, RealTime I think of as a motion picture. So if I pick a server and look at, say, one that's already been saved, I can start a real-time monitoring session anytime I want. What this is going to do is this is going to do a more in-depth query into what's going on in the database. So it's sampling once per second, going and seeing what's happening, showing me the numbers of SQL statements that are running, what types they are, some other information about locks and bytes, as well as the heaviest queries that are running during this time. So if I need to find something that's got related to something in my application, I can just type this and filter in on columns or tables or values. All that's available there. I can look and see slow queries, what tables are being accessed, what databases are being accessed. So I've got a lot of information here about what's going on in my active MySQL instance. Maybe I'm running this because someone called up and said, hey, things are slow. I can start this and let it run for 15, 20 minutes just to see what's going on. Maybe there's an important batch job that runs. I can run this over the weekend, come in on Monday and look at it. If nothing happened, then great. I've got a baseline for what normal looks like. The next weekend, if something bad happens, I can compare my good run against my bad run and look and see, is it a particular user? Is it a particular SQL statement? Is it a particular time of day where something bad's happening? It can really help me isolate where the bad behavior is coming from. Is it related to one particular statement? Is it related to an entire table, to a particular user, to a particular time of day? All those kinds of pieces of information help me narrow down to find the root cause of why a process, a job application, a job or something is possibly running slow. SQL has built in a slow log and a query log. Those are maintained by MySQL. As I said, those are either on the operating system as a file. Let me change this. Change what server I'm looking at. Or you can configure it so MySQL actually writes these to a table instead. In this case, they're written as a file. But I can look here, and for this is coming directly from the MySQL logs that MySQL maintains. We're querying the logs directly. We don't save this information since it's already in the log. The nice thing about this is I can change my time frame. I can add filters. I can change, as you saw, what server I'm looking at, as well as which log I'm looking at very, very, very quickly. That's quite handy. Sniffer is slightly different. This is a very, very handy tool that a lot of people get useful information out. If we call the slow log and the general log logs, the sniffer is what I would call a pseudo log. It's maintained not by MySQL, but by DM for MySQL. And what it's doing is based on certain criteria. It's looking and collecting data about queries that are running. What kind of information? I can specify users, hosts, runtimes, number of rows returned. I can also just optionally collect data on all queries and then go back in and based on who's running it and what errors are being generated, and I can get a lot of information about what's actually happening in the database. The general log and slow log are good for catching exceptions. The sniffer is good. It's a much broader net that I can cast that can potentially capture everything that's happening. And then I can, at my leisure later, I can go back and look over the next several days and see what was happening, who was running, what statements were running, what was taking all the time. Server configuration. We're going through on a regular basis and capturing the startup parameters for the MySQL instances. I can compare multiple servers. I can select up to 10 servers and then say, okay, how do these things compare to each other? And it's showing me where they differ. If I were, say, setting up a cluster or a replication group, if I were setting up a new server that needed to mimic production, if I wanted to make sure my load test environment mimicked my production server, I could just compare the configuration and look, and if port numbers are different or log file names are different, IP addresses are different, that's fine. But if some things like block sizes are different, launch times are different, if those are different, that's maybe something I want to pay attention to and go and fix just to make sure that my non-production systems are actually mimicking my production system. If I've got something simple like a different block size, that could really affect performance. And if I'm trying to make my load test system look like production, I want to come in here and make sure it really does look like production. Similarly, since we're capturing these, I can go over a period of time and look and see if there is one server that has different, sorry, that had its parameters change. Let me again pick a different server. Let's do this one. A lot of times DBAs will go in and maybe they'll change parameters and tell themselves they'll go and document it later or tell everybody about it later, but maybe they get distracted, maybe they forget, maybe they're changing it in the system and are busy with a lot of things. And eventually your performance may change. In this case, I can look over the last year and a half and see that the only variable that's changed in configuration on the server was the long query time. Someone changed it from 10 seconds down to 1 second. Probably so in our sandbox machine, we capture more long-running queries by changing the threshold from 10 seconds to 1 second. But a lot of times it's handy to come in here just to validate that the configuration hasn't changed. So I've got the ability to compare multiple servers as well as track individual changes. We're 35 minutes into a 45-minute webinar. So what I'm going to do is talk about in general, if I were to download this and try it, just to give you some pointers on where you should focus. Definitely dashboards, definitely monitors. Definitely remember you can go to Idera and get the free download. Definitely remember that the documentation is here. The documentation is very, very good. It's a full-blown wiki. Again, it's an agentless application, installs on Windows, installs on Linux, allows you to monitor remotely on-premise and cloud-based MySQL, MariaDB instances. It's very low overhead. There is a ton of knowledge and a ton of information in here. It's got a repository, so it's got a historical view on data that's configurable. The default is for a week, but you can change it to whatever you'd like. Also, let me say that if you do want more information, you can get contact information from our lovely sales team if you want a one-on-one demo, if you have more technical questions, if you have questions about how will this meet your needs in your environment, we'll be glad to set up a one-on-one. We've got staff available that can speak to you in your local language should you not be in America or need a demo in another language. We can certainly do that. I'm going to look quickly and see if we have any questions. I don't see any questions submitted either through the chat or through the polls, but on your GoToMeeting panel, there is a section for questions. If you have any questions, you can certainly type those in, either there or in the chat. And I'll be glad to answer those. In the meantime, I'll remind you that about the free download, the free trial, 2-week fully functional trial. And if you have any questions about the use of this product, its installation, I've been working with this product for a year and a half, and I've had one question on installation. Someone had a very specific question about SSH tunneling and how would they set that up. Other than that, the 28 people a day who download this and try it out have no problem whatsoever in getting it installed, getting it up and running. And as I said at the beginning, in literally 60 seconds, you can install it up and running, enter the credentials, and you're monitoring your MySQL instance. All right, I actually don't see any questions. So I will assume I did a perfect job and answered everyone's question before they had a chance to ask it. Okay, I do see a question. Let me see if I can scroll up. Okay, Alan is asking me to explain that when I say local language, if you want a demo, we do have partners in Central America that can, if you're more comfortable in Spanish, we can give you a one-on-one demo or tutorials or just answer whatever questions you have in Spanish as well. I speak a little bit of French and German, but probably not enough to answer technical questions. All right, so with that, I will wrap up today's webinar. I thank you for attending. I hope you have a chance to try it, download it. As I said, the documentation under Navigate has a great kind of self-guided tour of walking through the various sections. and taking a look at it. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to hearing from you a little later. Thank you.